And in this presentation, I will start from the observation that a large part of our experience is concealed by the tension towards the objects of experience. Becoming aware of this invisible part requires releasing this tension. Then I will describe the means that microphenomenology uses to elicit the loosening of this tension. On the basis of microphonological descriptions, I would like to show that this gesture of loosening induces a softening of the separations that usually structure our experience. In particular, the separation between a subject pole and an object pole. A softening that I will call the subtilization of experience. In other words, the process of becoming aware is in itself a process of subtilization of the structure of our ordinary experience. And the correlate of this subtilization is a process of solidification, usually unnoticed, that microphenomenology allows us to investigate. Finally, I will advocate the hypothesis that recognizing this subtle double process leads to an ontology that can be qualified as dynamic. So, explicitation interviews led by Pierre Vermersch and his team first highlighted a lack of awareness of the precise unfolding of our actions. So the explicitation interview was one of the sources of microphenomenology. So first, they highlighted a lack of awareness of our actions. This lack of awareness seems to originate in the absorption of attention into the objective, the result to be achieved, which masks the microdynamics of the action. For example, when I'm writing, my absorption into the written words masks the rapid succession of micro-acts which constitute my writing activity. For example, subtle inner adjustments to get in touch with what I want to say, slight tensions to hold on to what I want to say until a word or phrase emerges to say it. Rapid confrontation of the verbal expression with what I want to say, to assess its accuracy, relief of having found the right word, and so on. So, extending from the description of action to all types of experiences, perceptions, ideation, emotions, microphenomenological investigations have shown that the absorption into the objective of action is only a variant of the absorption into the object or content of experience, the what, to the detriment of the how. For example, when a sound occurs, the immediate reaction usually consists of identifying the physical object that is the source of the sound. In a fraction of a second, I recognize the sound as the song of a blackbird, and an image of this source comes surreptitiously to replace the sound, the experience of which becomes in some way transparent. As a consequence of this lack of awareness, representations or preconceptions are superimposed to lived experience that make its recognition even more difficult. To come back to the example of the sound, the tension or absorption into the object which produces the sound creates a distance between me here and the object there, which contributes to maintaining a representation of space as divided between an inner space and an outer space. It is important to note that in this perspective, it is not the representation that causes the lack of awareness of experience, even if it reinforces it. But it is a tension towards the object which prevents us from recognizing the experience for what it is. Therefore, the process of becoming aware doesn't consist in suspending representations, for example, of a separation between inner and outer space in order to access experience. How can we suspend a representation when we are unaware of its very existence? But the microphonological approach consists in releasing the tension towards the object, which, by obscuring the separation process, creates a representation of this separation as pre-given. To induce the gesture of releasing tension towards the objective of the action or towards the object of experience, the microphonological approach uses three main complementary processes: evocation, exploration of the microdynamics of experience, and the particular relationship created between the interviewer and the interviewee, which also plays an essential role in the releasing of tensions. First, the evocation process. A microphonological interview focuses on a past experience, which may have been lived a few days or weeks or even years ago, or on provoked experiences just before the interview for the needs of the research. The interviewed person is invited to let this experience come back until it becomes even more present than the interview situation is. This particular remembering process is called evocation. The evocation process plays an essential role in releasing tensions. Indeed, in the evocation state, the goal has already been achieved. The object has already been identified. This allows the interviewee to relax her attention on the goal or object more easily than in the initial experience. For example, when exploring in the evocation state the microgenesis of an idea, you can loosen your absorption into its content because this content has already emerged. You cannot lose it. When exploring in evocation your experience of listening to a sound, you don't have to identify its source because it is something that you already did at the moment when you discovered it. This allows you to relax your attention on this source, to become aware of previously unnoticed dimensions of the experience. Making an effort to remember might, however, introduce a new tension that would once again mask these unnoticed dimensions. But it turns out that evocation is based on a form of recollection which is involuntary. The memory cannot be targeted voluntarily and directly, but it pops up unexpectedly, unpredictably, beyond the control of the interviewee, thanks to sensory triggers, of which Proust's Madeleine is a famous example. The interview technique therefore consists in freeing the interviewed subject from the objective of remembering by arousing a receptive, passive attention through interventions such as the key sentence that microphonologists know well. I suggest, if you agree, that you take the time to let the moment just before you heard the sound, for example, come back. The words "let the moment come back" are, contrary to "retrieve this moment," an invitation to relax any effort. The words "take the time to" are also important because they authorize an absence of immediate response, and therefore the time of silence, of latency, necessary for the emergence of the memory. They divert the interviewee from the temptation to fill this vacuum hastily with the expression of knowledge about the experience, which would once again be superimposed on it. The slowing down of the verbal flow and the presence of moments of silence are then signs that the interviewee is actually in this receptive, passive position. While the natural, ordinary attitude is an objective attitude of tension towards the realization of an objective or the recognition of an object, evocation, by its very structure, arouses the relaxation of the projective, intentional structure of temporality. It has the power to relax, to soften the pro-tensions that ordinarily create and maintain the thread of time. It has the power to undo in some way the pro-tensional structure of time. Interestingly, the opportunity offered by the microphonological interview to experience this mode of temporality arouses in many interviewees a feeling of relief, even wonder. As Gusdorf, a French philosopher, specialist of concrete memory in the last century, wrote, evocation brings to experience a whole new value of enchantment and liberation. The release of tension toward the goal or object elicited by the evocation allows the microdynamics of experience to emerge into consciousness. But conversely, the systematic exploration of this microdynamic is a mean complementary to evocation to loosen the tension towards the object. This exploration doesn't consist in reorienting or converting a focused and effortful attention from the object to the different moments of the experience, but to foster their spontaneous emergence into awareness in the state of receptivity characteristic of evocation. The interview allows us to apply this technique of mild unfolding of the microdynamics not only to actions that visibly unfold over time, such as memorizing a list of words, but to experience that are ordinarily considered instantaneous, such as hearing a sound of having an inside, allowing us to become aware of microgenesis that are ordinarily invisible. For example, let's imagine that in the context of a project on the experience of natural spaces, I invite you to choose a moment when you first discovered a beautiful landscape and to explore this moment through a microphonological interview. It is probable that you would first describe the object of experience, in this case, the elements of the landscape. For example, a wood, birches. The main part of the interview would then consist in helping you relax the fixation of your attention on these visual elements by becoming aware of the microdynamics of this encounter. From the very first contact until the moment you were able to recognize and perhaps name its elements. What happened in the meantime? I will come back to this question in a moment. The evocation process and the exploration of the microdynamics of experience are thus complementary means to arouse the process of becoming aware of one's lived experience by releasing tensions on objects. The relationship created during the interview is essential to this process. Indeed, by agreeing to perform this gesture of releasing, the interviewee gives up the control she has or thinks she has over her experience. She takes the risk of discovering a dimension of herself that she doesn't know yet, and even of feeling a sense of self waver. In order to enter this state of vulnerability and to do this intimate work in the presence of the interviewer, it is essential that the interviewee feels the interviewer totally present, attentive, and benevolent. The relationship of trust that is created is thus one of the keystones of the interview. Now, let us examine more closely what the gesture of releasing tension towards objects of experience consists of. This gesture can be explored relatively easily through a very ordinary tactile experiment consisting of touching an object, such as a stone, a piece of fabric, or, like here, the bark of a tree. To begin with, you would be invited to explore it actively in order to recognize it and identify its tactile properties. Then, you would be invited to switch from the touching mode to the being touched mode by letting yourself be touched by the object. This shift from the touching mode to the being touched mode can be experienced in all sensory modalities. For example, instead of actively trying to identify the origin or characteristics of a sound, you can let yourself be touched by it. What does this subtle but nevertheless very precise gesture consist of? This shift has been described to us as a gesture of disengagement, of disinvestment from the object, operating through a demobilization of the gaze, which occurs even in non-visual experiences, and also a movement of going back and descent into the body, associated with a defocusing and receptivity of attention. For example, the invitation to describe my immediate experience of the landscape before the recognition of its objective elements leads me to disinvest my gaze, to enter into quasi-corporeal contact with this experience. This gesture of demobilization of the gaze has repeatedly been described to us as associated with a descent into the body, often initiated by a subtle adjustment towards the back of the skull, which causes densification of this area and of the back of the body. This descent fosters two concomitant gestures, consisting on the one hand in widening attentional scope, which from focused becomes panoramic, peripheral, diffuse, and on the other hand in making oneself receptive. The movement of stretching towards the object give way to an attitude of welcoming, of letting come, allowing one to be impregnated by the phenomenon, like when we breathe a perfume. Here is a description of this experience collected in a microphonological interview. Suddenly, I felt what it is actually to see. To see isn't casting your gaze towards something, projecting it, holding it out, but really it's letting the thing imprint itself in you. You are completely passive and you let the color, the landscape come to you. You aren't going to look for it. You're going to gather it in. You're there and you receive it. And you have the impression that the color or the landscape imprints it inside you. For those of you who are familiar with the microphenomenology, here is a representation of the structure of this shift produced during a training in microphenomenological analysis. I won't explain this schema. According to the testimonies we have collected, the gesture of releasing tension towards objects has the effect of softening the structure of lived space. The object pole, the subject pole, and the limit between the two lose concomitantly their solidity. Oh. Sorry, each time something comes on the screen, it erases my. So. If you could evitate to send messages on the because each time I will have this problem of with my my own screen. So first, what does the gesture of releasing do to the object? Let's take the example of the landscape again. Suppose that I release tensions towards the elements of the landscape to let myself be touched by it. Suppose that instead of looking for objects over there, I let the colors, the shapes, movements, sounds come to me. What I will perceive of the landscape is no longer solid objects, but a world of fleeting impressions, of intensities, discontinuities, rhythms, subtle feelings that we could call its atmosphere. Unlike the elements of the landscape, which are seen, heard, touched, or smelled, these feelings do not fall under a specific sensory modality. The vocabulary used to describe their texture indeed calls simultaneously on several sensory registers. The visual register, we talk about shape, brightness, shadow, blur. The kinesthetic or tactile register, we talk about vibration, pulsation, pressure, density, weight, texture, temperature. The auditory register, we talk about rhythm, echo, resonance, half tones, sometimes even the olfactory or gustatory registers. We talk of taste. These feelings are thus, strictly speaking, neither visual nor kinesthetic, tactile or auditory sensations. However, they have specific precise sensory submodalities, such as intensity, direction, density, and rhythm, which have the characteristic of being transmodal, that is to say, transposable from one sensory modality to another one. In these subtle feelings, the border usually perceived between the different sensory registers dissolves somehow. It is as if the five senses condensed themselves in them. Moreover, while the elements of the landscape can be located in space over there, at a distance from myself, whose point of view is located here, transmodal feelings are difficult to locate in an inner or outer space. It is as if these feelings were dissolving the boundary between the landscape and me. Here is a description of this experience. In such moments, there are no longer any barriers between me and things. It is as though I no longer had a skin. For example, that poplar over there, it's as though something was radiating from it, a quivering, a diffuse light, a very quiet and very fine sound, which comes right up to me and touches me in an indescribable way. Everything becomes incredibly touching. It's as though the space between things became denser, more luminous, more vibrant, and as though there was nothing else left except this space. In this experience, or type of experience, the vibrations of light, the ebb and flow of water, the texture of trees and stones, the breath of the wind do not break at the border of the skin, but unite inside and outside into an uninterrupted space. This process of softening of experience, as the tension towards the object is released, has been described to us many times. Whether the experience is perceptual, cognitive, emotional, aesthetic, spiritual, or intersubjective. It is particularly clear in the experience of ideation, which highlights the blurring of the boundary not only between sensory modalities, between interior and exterior, but between mind and body. The divestment of the content of the idea, whether expressed in verbal, mathematical, pictorial, or musical form, by highlighting its microgenesis, reveals that the idea first emerges as a subtle transmodal feeling, an inner direction, an inclination, a rhythm, a line of force, endowed with quasi-visual, quasi-tactile, or quasi-kinesthetic qualities, which are very specific to this idea. The microgenesis of the idea is then punctuated by subtle transmodal clues, which inform the thinker about the unfolding of the idea. For example, a feeling of sudden cohesion between elements previously scattered, or a feeling of coherence between the pieces of a puzzle, or of encounter between several paths, or of completeness, or a feeling of filling a gap. In the specific transmodal landscape, we could say, which characterizes an idea, the rigid separation usually established between body and mind thus becomes meaningless. Although the thinker may sometimes feel immersed in it, in this landscape, and move within it, this landscape is perceived neither outside of him nor within him, but as a space where the boundary between interior and exterior vanishes. Now, what does the gesture of releasing the tension towards the object does to the subject? So, in this process of softening of the solidity of the object and of the border between inside and outside, my perceptual position, previously perceived as a dense point of view, usually localized at the level of the eyes, becomes more difficult to locate in space. It diffuses, it dilutes, while losing its solidity and its location. It loses its visual, auditory, or tactile modality. It becomes less sensorially determined. This loss of location and density of the point of view has the effect of weakening the feeling of personal identity, the feeling of being a solid I, which becomes lighter. This weakening is notably manifested by the softening of the sense of ownership, the feeling that this experience is mine. It is as if the phenomenon was detaching itself from its mineness. For example, the feeling that this emerging idea is my idea fades. Interviewees don't say, I have an idea, or an idea is coming to me, but there is an idea. In the same way, as the sound emerges in a space that is neither subjective nor objective, this experience is not felt as being immediately mine, as being my experience. Another dimension of the sense of identity, the sense of agency, namely the sense that I am the one who is generating the experience, weakens. The release of tension towards the object is indeed characterized by the adoption of a position of receptivity, of pacing, waiting for the phenomenon to occur. Therefore, the phenomenon is often perceived as emerging by itself, without the intervention of an acting subject. Such a sense of passivity, of lack of control, is described in many interviews. I hear my mouth asking the question. My hands have their own will. It happens to me. It doesn't depend on me. It's given to me. Or this is, so to speak, contemplating the own development of this idea. The spontaneous and unexpected emergence of the phenomenon is often accompanied by a feeling of surprise, which is characteristic of the process of becoming aware. So we can summarize these findings like this. Becoming aware of our experience requires releasing tensions on objects. And this releasing has the effect of softening or subtilizing the object pole, the subject pole, and their separation. In other words, the very process of becoming aware has the effect of subtilizing experience. It would be even more accurate to say that they are one and the same process. The very gesture which enables one to become aware subtilizes experience. The very process of becoming aware of experience is structurally a process of desubstantialization or subtilization of lived experience. To understand this process, let us take an even closer look to the gesture of release, which has the power of subtilizing or softening experience. This gesture doesn't consist of redirecting a focused attention emanating from a solid point of view, from a layer of solid and coarse phenomena, towards a layer of more subtle and elusive phenomena, layers which would be coexistent. But the very gesture of releasing the tension on the object subtilizes the world. For example, becoming aware of the experience of encountering a landscape doesn't consist in reorienting a focal, objective attention from the elements of the landscape towards subtle feelings that would pre-exist this reorientation. But the very gesture of releasing focal attention softens the boundary between the landscape and me, between what is seen, heard, and touched, boundaries which literally vanish. This means that the gesture of releasing objective tensions is not a cognitive mental act of reorientation of attention, but a quasi-corporal gesture of disgrasping endowed with the power to attenuate or soften the very texture and structure of the word. It's not a cognitive process, but an ontological process of fluidification or softening of being. If the gesture of releasing tensions subtilizes the word, we can hypothesize that its correlate, the gesture of tension, solidifies the word. We can hypothesize that in the same way that the gesture of releasing tension subtilizes experience, softening the separation between the subject and object poles, a gesture of tension solidifies experience, creating and maintaining the separation between the two poles. The microphonological method allows us to explore this hypothesis, which has so far been little explored due to lack of adequate methods. To explore this process, we began to identify, based on concrete descriptions, the main parameters of objectivity, the essential characteristics that make it possible to experience an object. For example, an object has to be distant, and located. Then we conducted microphonological interviews to try to identify and describe possible microgestures associated with each parameter. We have thus collected in all sensory modalities the description of a gesture of distancing intended to arouse and maintain the experience of distality, that is to say, the perception of objects as being out there. In the tactile modality, this gesture involves tiny movements of the fingers required to create and maintain a boundary between the touching body and the object being touched, without which the separation between subject and object disappears. These tiny movements are accompanied by a tension at the level of the gaze, or it seems that they seem to be. These subtle visual and kinesthetic micro-movements seem to elicit the emergence and stabilization of the perception at the level of the skin of a border between an inner space and an outer space, contributing to separating a subject and an object pole, which vanishes when these micro-movements stop completely. I hypothesize that recognizing this double process of subtilization and solidification of experience leads to an ontology that can be qualified as dynamic. We can describe it as follows. The structure that seems the most essential to experience, the separation between a subject pole and an object pole, is not pre-given, but created instant after instant by microtensions. When these tensions soften, this apparently essential structure becomes more fragile and may even vanish. In other words, we don't have a pre-given word made of different layers or more or less subtle phenomena, and different modes of attention giving us access to these different layers. But microgestures solidify or subtilize the world, creating different experiential architectures, we could say. In this perspective, instead of two separate poles, subject and object, we have one dynamic spectrum of increasing solidity or density of the experience of the subject-object couple that can be roughly represented like this: the concentric cycles representing the two poles, and the arrows representing the solidifying tensions. In sum, microphenomenology allows us not only to foster the releasing of tensions towards objects, thanks to the interview means, but to describe finely the process of dissolution of structures which is generated. The method allows us also to become aware of the usually unrecognized tensions which generate the solid structures of the usual world, and investigate the microgenesis of these structures. Since it is from these micro-tensions that the very distinction between subject and object arise, they cannot be considered as a subjective process, neither as an objective process. Microphenomenology, in taking on the task of studying these microtensions, therefore adopts neither a subjectivist or idealist position, nor an objectivist or realist perspective, but a perspective that lies beyond the split between subject and object. Let us add that in this dynamic approach, becoming aware of experience being a subtilization of reality, and blindness to experience being a solidification of reality, the border ordinarily drawn between epistemology and ontology is attenuated and even disappears. The usual philosophical categorizations are difficult to apply to it. This is why we use the term ontology in the broadest sense as the study of what is there, independently of the scission between being and knowing, of which microphenomenology allows us to investigate the emergence and vanishing, thus undertaking a dynamic ontology. A particularly valuable light on the dynamic ontology that is emerging is provided by the Buddhist tradition, whose numerous schools have developed various practices aimed at seeing reality as it is. I find very striking that all these practices start, like microphenomenology, from the observation that we don't perceive reality as it is. We don't recognize it. A training, an apprenticeship is required to recognize what we live, what is there. What is also striking is that this training consists mainly in learning to release the tensions that solidify reality, in particular by creating a separation between a subject pole and an object pole. And this release has the effect of gradually subtilizing lived experience, of gradually dissolving the subject-object separation. In meditative, contemplative practices too. I find it reassuring to note that two types of practices which have set themselves the goal of exploring lived experience in a very precise way, even if they developed with different objectives at different times and in very different cultural contexts, have made similar observations and resulted in similar processes of becoming aware, in the sense that both give rise to a subtilization of experience. So the main difference is that in microphenomenological practice, the release is provisional. It waits for the emergence of an object to describe, while in meditative practice, the release is radical, definitive. In microphenomenological practice, the gesture of loosening tensions towards objects can be compared to a shift between the touching and the being touched mode, as we have seen. However, this shift still implies the expectation of something, a feeling in, and what is received can in turn be taken as an object. For example, stopping listening out to the source of the sound to let the sound come to you doesn't prevent you from apprehending the felt sound as a subtle object and making it in turn an object of investigation and description. On the contrary, in meditative practice, even the subtle tension consisting in letting oneself be touched by something, in making oneself be receptive, dissolves. While the microphonological loosening or letting go is temporary and prepares for a letting come, the meditative letting go is pushed to its end. This radical loosening has been compared to the movement of a bale of straw when you cut the tie that binds it. It is the exhaustion of any effort, down to the most subtle. So it goes further, much further than microphonological practice. When any tension is released, vision sees, hearing hears, without a seeing subject and a seeing object, a hearing subject and a heard object being constituted. All that remains is a pure self-knowing quality, a pure lucidity, devoid of relation to a knowing subject and to a known object. When the effort to sustain the solidity of the world is exhausted, a great relief occurs. An immense free space opens up. In this totally unobstructed, transparent space, a kind of sweetness, of tenderness arises. As recognized in the text of all Buddhist traditions, awareness is inseparable from love, like the two wings of a bird. It is so important in Buddhist tradition that I cannot not mention this. So this dynamic vision, which the different philosophical schools of Buddhism have refined over the centuries on the basis of meditative practice, is very precious for understanding, questioning, and refining the dynamic ontology, which is beginning to emerge from microphonological practice. So, as a conclusion, I will express two general thoughts on research on lived experience. The study of lived experience, what is closest to us, the very flesh of our existence, has been until recently almost totally excluded from Western philosophy as from science. This new discipline is only in its infancy, but it already gives us a glimpse of the huge transformations it could induce. On the one hand, it seems to undermine the structures that we thought were essential to our lived experience, the separation between interior and exterior space, subject and object, body and mind. Becoming conscious of our lived experience amounts to lightening or even dissolving these separations. What could be the impact of this subtilization on our lives? We sense that it could be huge on our intersubjective relationships, our relationships with non-human beings, on our way of learning, of creating, even on our way of dying. We sense that becoming aware of our lived experience could lead to completely novel ways of thinking by getting us out of the conceptual ruts we are stuck in. These are examples of the many avenues of research which are opening up to microphenomenology and first-person research more generally. One of the difficulties we are facing at the moment is the very experiential dimension of this research. Explaining our results is not enough. To understand them, for example, to understand the vanishing of the inner-outer separation, You have to live this, or at least be open for an experiential glimpse. If not, this result may appear completely ununderstandable and even crazy. This creates a gulf between people, at least may create a gulf between people, that we cannot just fill in with words. This is why one of the current lines of research in microphenomenology is to develop training to make the method more easily accessible and to imagine ways to quickly give a taste of the dimensions we are exploring to persons who are not familiar with them by helping them recognize them in their own lived experience. I will stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.